Ladies and gentlemen, if you have spent any amount of time studying the evidence for and against Christianity, then you are well aware that there are a lot of arguments about whether or not the four Gospels are eyewitness testimony.
All of the Gospels, according to some of the greatest scholars of Christianity, are anonymous.
But they were recorded.
They don't know who wrote them.
Very early
They
on.
don't know who wrote them. Why? Because the authors of the Gospels never declared who they were. So how can you make a claim that the authors were eyewitnesses when you don't know who the authors were?
This exchange, and I use the word exchange very loosely because it's really just a Muslim guy yelling at a random Christian woman. But in any case, this exchange here, the Muslim makes a very common argument. The Gospels are not eyewitnesses. We don't know who wrote them, and therefore, how in the world can you trust the scriptures of Christianity? So in this video, I'm going to show, with what I consider to be very conclusive evidence, that the four Gospels, or at least Matthew and John, are in fact eyewitness testimony.
We actually don't know who wrote the Gospels. We know that it's not the people that appear in the titles because those were tacked on later. That's the mainstream view of the titles that are tacked on to the Gospels.
This is the elephant in the room that I need to start by addressing. See, there is a really common atheist claim on the internet that it is the mainstream opinion, or the majority opinion, or the consensus opinion of scholarship that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. Ladies and gentlemen, I challenge you to find any study that actually shows that. As far as I am aware, there is only one survey that has ever been done sampling what historians say about the authorship of the Gospels, and it found that there are slightly more historians that grant the traditional authorship of the Gospels than those who oppose it. So in fact, the view that I am arguing for is slightly the majority view. For those who want to know more about this study, it was done by a guy named Josh Pelletier. It was a master's thesis, and he is a student of Mike Licona. And so for that reason, I'm going to link this video below, Who Wrote the Gospel of Mark by Mike Licona. It is a very good video, and I suggest you check it out if you want to learn more about this. Now, a critic could rightly point out that truth is not a democracy. Just because most scholars think that the Gospels were written by their traditional authors, that doesn't mean they're correct. And furthermore, even if it did, it's not this unheard of fringe position. It's only slightly less than 50% of scholars that take the view that we can't know who wrote the Gospels. So with that in mind, we do need to turn to the actual evidence. So here it is. These are the three main arguments against the traditional authorship of the Gospels and the three main arguments for the traditional authorship. The three main arguments against the traditional authorship of the Gospels goes something like this. First of all, the Gospels do not internally claim to be written by apostles, says the argument. And so therefore, since they are internally anonymous, they're not even claiming to have been written by the apostles, so we can't take them seriously as eyewitness testimony. The second argument that a lot of critics of the Bible will put forward is that it seems that Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source from time to time. They're very similar. And so, if Matthew is eyewitness testimony, why in the world is he using Mark, not an eyewitness, as a source? And then the third and final argument is the simplest one. There's lots of errors and contradictions in the Bible, and because eyewitness testimony is generally reliable and the Bible is generally unreliable, it therefore follows that the Bible must not be eyewitness testimony. So first off, the argument that, the Gospels don't internally claim to be written by Matthew or John, I'm not entirely sure that's true. John 21, verses 24 through 25, seem to kind of imply that John is the author of the book. But even getting rid of that point, it doesn't really matter because this entire argument is objectively terrible. According to this detailed study by Mike Licona, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? He sampled every Greco-Roman biography written from 150 BC to 150 AD. There were about 90 of these biographies. And do you want to know how many of them were not anonymous internally? 2. 88 of the 90 Gospels did not claim to be written by the person that they were written by. And yet for most of them, historians don't really dispute that they know who wrote them. So this argument is a huge, indisputable double standard against the Bible. Second atheist argument goes something like, well, if Matthew is eyewitness testimony, then why in the world is it using Mark as a source? Why does Matthew take information from Mark, right? And if you stop and think about this argument for a second, you will see that it too is an obviously terrible argument, because Mark, according to tradition, was the interpreter of Peter. And the Bible says numerous times, including in Matthew's gospel, that Peter had access to certain information about Jesus that even the other apostles did not. So it's no dilemma that Matthew would have wanted to know Peter's testimony and used Mark as a source. What's the problem? Now, the final argument to talk about is that, oh, well, there's errors in the Gospels, there's contradictions in the Gospels, so of course they can't be eyewitness testimony. They're unreliable. First of all, this argument is a huge, enormous circle. We know Christianity is not true because the Gospels are not eyewitness testimony. We know they're not eyewitness testimony because there's errors in the Bible and Christianity is not true. The argument is extremely fallacious. Even if we forget about that, even if we say, for the sake of argument, sure, there are contradictions in the Gospels. Guess what? Eyewitnesses contradict each other all the time. What's the point? How does that show that we can't know who wrote the Gospels? This is a ridiculous argument. Now, an argument that shows that the four Gospels are in fact written by their traditional authors is the testimony of the Church Fathers. This is a very conclusive argument. Within 200 years of the life of Jesus, we have 6 different sources that testify that the Gospels were written by their traditional authors. Now, before you hear someone online say, oh, you can't trust these sources, they're written decades or 100 or 200 years after, guess what? Historians across the board almost never dispute that Plutarch wrote Plutarch's Lives. How do they know that? Plutarch's Lives are written anonymously. They know that because the Lamprius Catalog, which was written over 200 years later, says so. In other words, historians are willing to unilaterally accept that we know who wrote a book because one document says so centuries later. But all of a sudden, whenever we talk about the Bible, having 6 documents within 200 years isn't enough. This is a huge, enormous atheist double standard against the Bible. Be consistent. Either the 4 Gospels are eyewitness testimony, or at least Matthew and John, or your second option, historians across the board are wrong, we have no idea who wrote anything in the ancient world. Take your pick. Another argument that I see people struggling to respond to is the fact that many of our ancient manuscripts, most of our ancient manuscripts of the 4 Gospels, say on the top of them, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John, right? We see this consensus all throughout these early copies of the Gospels. How did all of the copyists of the Bible agree that they were written by their traditional authors if it was really just a myth that someone made up later? The final argument that I'll give here for the traditional authorship of the Gospels is just generally how historically reliable they are. There's a very interesting study that Richard Bauckham talked about. What's in a name, right? In a nutshell, the argument goes that Jews in Palestine and Jews outside of Palestine in the first century had very different names. And that would be very easy for a later author to mix up. And yet, the commonality of the names in the New Testament is extremely similar to the commonality of the names in first century Palestine. The author was extremely familiar with the demographics of first century Palestine. All of the names common in the New Testament, like James and John and Jesus and Peter and Judas, and all these names are extremely common in first century Palestine. Mary is an extremely common female name. All of the names that were common outside of Rome, but not where Jesus allegedly lived, we don't see those often in the Gospels. This is some extremely good detective work on part of the 4 Gospels, if they are not eyewitness testimony. The long story short is that all of the arguments against the traditional authorship of the Gospels are extremely huge double standards that are obviously just intended to degrade the Bible, regardless of where the evidence points. On the other hand, the evidence for the historical reliability of the 4 Gospels is stronger than that of any other ancient Greco-Roman biography. Follow the evidence where you will.